And so many of the tax havens established in the world today, particularly in the Caribbean, were established during the slave trade, which began after the Spanish Inquisition took place under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1472. And by 1492, all the Jews in Spain were expelled, and they either fled to Portugal or hopped aboard ships and travelled to the Caribbean, where a vast Marrano Jewish community arose. And so let's have a look at that story now. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Jewish Marrano money changers from Spain and Portugal had established colonies in the Caribbean under Spanish rule. On August 1st, 1492, Christopher Columbus, as we call him, set sail from Spain to escape the Spanish Inquisition. On board he had with him 5 wealthy Marrano Jewish merchants as well. Their plan was to capture 500 American native slaves and bring them back to Europe, which they did, but the American natives were not very good slaves, so the Africans became preferred. Here is a monumento in Madrid showing Queen Isabella of Castile, Spain, celebrating Christopher Columbus under his real name, Colon. It was Columbus's son who returned to Jamaica in 1510 with his family and began living in Jamaica and ruling the island. The Portuguese Inquisition in 1536 brought a number of Jewish families to Holland, which provided a safe haven for the Portuguese Jews. Here is a painting of Menasai ben Israel by Rembrandt, who lived in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, showing him with a broad hat, white trim collar and a Van Dyck beard, just like the other Dutch burghers of Dutch and Portuguese descent. In October 1655, this Kabbalistic Sephardic rabbi arrived in London at Cromwell's invitation to discuss his book, The Hope of Israel. Menasai ben Israel peppered Cromwell with the idea that England's economy would benefit from the Jews. In England, by 1654, Oliver Cromwell began advocating for the return of the Jews back into England, due to their support of him throughout the English Revolution and for the new army that the Jews in England had financed. That year, Cromwell also heard a report of Captain Jackson, an English privateer, who returned from ransacking Jamaica and submitted a report to the Colonial Affairs Committee that Jamaica was occupied by converso or Marrano Jews who wanted England to protect them from the Spanish. In 1654, Cromwell summoned the Spanish ambassador and bluntly told him the British friendship with Spain was under threat so long as Spain opposed the British in the New World. By this time, Cromwell had already planned to send an armed fleet to the Caribbean. In December 1654, a fleet departed Portsmouth under the joint command of Admiral William Penn. With the fleet, he carried an army of 2,500 men under the command of General Venables. First stop was Barbados, where Venables tripled the size of his army with the beat of a drum in the public square and promised freedom. So a fifth of the population joined him. On their way to Jamaica, they stopped at Santo Domingo and made an unsuccessful attack, losing 1,000 men cut down by 300 mounted Spanish. Eventually, the British fleet reached Jamaica on May the 10th, 1655, at Cromwell's command. And over the next 15 months, Cromwell's efforts to allow the Jews back into England would be spurred on by the role of the Jews in Jamaica's conquest and the promise of their valued assistance to develop the New World Empire. Cromwell began advocating the Grand Western design, which was designed and financed by Jews, who allegedly planned to settle England and buy St. Paul's Cathedral and turn it into a synagogue. The prominent Jewish leader in London, Mr. Carvajal, was Cromwell's key advisor, and he owned many ships involved in the slave trade, and he advocated Jamaica to Cromwell. Mr. Carvajal was 46 when he arrived in London in 1635. He rode up to the city gates of London, riding a white Arabian stallion, dressed in fine armour, leading a string of pack mules carrying gold bullion. When he was halted by the King's Guard at the gates, he announced he was a merchant from the Canary Islands and had come to join a sister who was married to the Portuguese ambassador, so he was allowed into London. Mr. Carvajal knew that Francisco Carvajal, probably his relation, lived in Jamaica and led the army there, and that he would assist the military support to a British conquest. So these two Carvajals helped Oliver Cromwell establish British rule in Jamaica By 1658 his imports account for 8.3% of London's customs revenue. On one occasion Carvajal's shipment was seized by custom officers, and so later he broke into the warehouse and held the guard at sword point and threatened to run him through while his servants emptied the warehouse. The police report described him as having grizzled beard and a fiery temper, and no pretense hand with the rapier, while his servant Manuel Fonseca could double his fist with any Englishman. Charges were dropped when the man called the Great Jew died later that year. In early 1655, when Cromwell announced a settlement policy for Jamaica, in the previous 5 years Jamaica had become the burial ground for almost 3/4 of the 12,000 men, women, children and slaves who arrived there with the British. 5 years later, 1660, Port Royal was the busiest port in the New World, often visited by pirates who sold their riches cheaply to the merchant class of the Jews and Europeans together, who brought the treasures back to London and to the rest of Europe to be sold. Jamaica saw the growth of sugarcane plantations, slaves, piracy, and Port Royal rapidly grew from 1660 onwards, and the dark age of slave trading and piracy had begun. By 1663, 22 pirate captains had grand residences in Port Royal, and some even shod their horses with silver horseshoes. The most famous English pirate since Sir Francis Drake was Sir Henry Morgan. Sir Henry Morgan was a Welsh privateer who fought for the English against the Spanish in the Caribbean during the 1660s and 1670s. He is remembered as the greatest of the privateers, amassing huge fleets, attacking prominent targets and being the worst enemy of the Spanish since Sir Francis Drake. Morgan was knighted by King Charles II of England and died in Jamaica a rich man, just like Sir Francis Drake was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I. And so Port Royal was given its name because of its association with British royalty after the English Revolution, people like Oliver Cromwell and his successors. And we know that also this was a place of drunkenness and great debauchery, and it had its heyday from the 1660s right through to the 7th June 1692, when that town was swept into the Caribbean Ocean because of a giant earthquake and also a tsunami that followed and killed 2,000 people. And local ministers at the time considered it an act of God because of the debauchery that was going on there. Likewise, the same thing happened with Pompeii, 79 AD, when that city was covered with ash from Mount Vesuvius, and people thought at that time it was due to the drunkenness and debauchery going on in that place. And likewise, in Sodom in biblical times, 2000 BC, that city was covered with sulfur, and we know that was due to drunkenness and debauchery as well. According to the history of the Bevis Marks synagogue in London that was built by Jews soon after they were allowed to legally return to England in 1664, Abraham Israel Fernandez Carvajal had originally settled in London around 1632 as a Portuguese Jew posing as a Portuguese Marrano Catholic. These Sephardic Jews moved into the Iberian Peninsula with the Celts when they moved there, all the way from Idumea in the southern part of Judea. Like many Marranos living around the Lisbon, Portugal area, he had grown wealthy from the slave trade between Africa and America and back to the ports of Europe. The London Jews say Mr. Carvajal is sometimes called the first English Jew, or the Great Jew, who with a group of about 20 Marrano families lived in London. At the time in London, the Goose and Gridiron Ale House, which was situated there in St Paul's Churchyard, was a Masonic lodge. The Goose and Gridiron eventually moved to the King or Queen's Arms Tavern and later became the West Indian and American Lodge. According to the author Abby LaRudin, the Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane near Drury Lane is where Oliver Cromwell met as a Mason. Together with the two other lodges, the Apple Tree and Rummer and Grapes, on the 24th of June 1717, these four lodges formed the Grand Lodge of London, which became the first Grand Orient Jewish lodge in the British Commonwealth. Anyway, prior to the Jews being legally entitled to stay in England, the Marrano Jewish merchants helped finance and support Oliver Cromwell's new army, made up of local dissidents, German mercenaries and Jewish money. This allowed for Oliver Cromwell to fight the English Civil War against Charles I and brought about the English Revolution, which culminated in Charles I, the Scottish king, being executed for treason. This is what happened. On the 16th of June 1647, Oliver Cromwell wrote a letter to another Marano Jew living in Mulheim, Germany, called Ebenezer Pratt. The letter was found in 1813 by Napoleon Bonaparte in a synagogue in Mulheim, which is how it became public. It says, "In return for financial support, will advocate admission of the Jews. This is impossible while Charles is still alive." It was Ebenezer Pratt who drafted the charges for Oliver Cromwell to bring against Charles I for treason, when really Oliver Cromwell was the traitor all along. In December of 1648, the Rump Parliament of England was formed, when the majority of the parliamentarians, who were Scottish Presbyterians, were purged, and so democracy was usurped. The only remaining members were called the Levellers, who were the Freemasons who wanted Charles I tried and executed. Hence the name was given the Rump Parliament, meaning the arse end of Parliament. In return for assistance, Oliver promised the Jews that he would help them rebuild the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, as well as allow the Jews back into England. None of those promises he kept, and the Anabaptists criticised Cromwell for the messianic way he presented himself to the Jews. In 1645, Mr. Carvajal was denounced by an informer for not attending a Protestant church, but was defended by the leading merchants of the day, and so the House of Lords quashed the proceedings. Meanwhile, the Civil War in England was playing out, and eventuated in Charles I being executed in January 1649. When the Anglo-Spanish War began in 1655, Cromwell seized all property belonging to the Spaniards living in its territory. But when another Jew, Antonio Rodriguez Robles, found himself denounced and threatened with the loss of all of his property, Carvajal led the entire Sephardic community to appeal to Cromwell and the Council State to recognise them as Jewish refugees rather than as Catholic Marano Spaniards. Suddenly they admitted to being Jews and were granted permission to stay in London. In 1657, Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel petitioned Oliver Cromwell to readmit the Jews legally back into England. Cromwell appointed an assembly of lawyers and divines to look into the matter. They came back in favour. However, the existing English merchants regarded the Jews as competition and were opposed to it, and so it was Charles II who legally had readmitted the Jews in 1664. Charles II was thankful for the support some Jews in Holland had given him. 2 years later, in 1666, the Fire of London took place, which wiped out the commercial centre of the City of London, and by 1694 the Jews owned the private Bank of England, and by 1695 the Bank of Scotland as well.